The ancient world was filled with cruelty, but Carthage stood out as one of the most feared powers in the Mediterranean. For centuries, the city was a wealthy empire that controlled trade, dominated the seas, and terrified its enemies. Yet, what is often forgotten in history is not only how powerful Carthage was, but also how brutal its punishments could be. The enemies of Carthage faced punishments so horrifying that even Rome, which was no stranger to cruelty, often told stories about them with shock and disgust. Carthage was not a small tribal kingdom. It was a mighty city-state located in modern-day Tunisia, and at its peak it controlled territories stretching across North Africa, parts of Spain, Sicily, and many islands of the Mediterranean. Its navy was unmatched, its merchants were wealthy, and its generals like Hannibal were legendary. But all of this wealth and power came at a cost. Carthage dealt with rebellion, espionage, and war constantly, and to maintain control, its leaders believed fear was the best weapon. Punishments were not only meant to remove threats, but also to terrify anyone who thought about resisting. One of the most disturbing punishments Carthage is remembered for was the ritual execution of enemies and traitors by fire. Historical sources, especially from Roman writers, describe how Carthaginians would burn people alive as offerings to their gods. The most infamous god was Baal Hammon, often associated with fire and sacrifice. Victims were sometimes placed into the hollow bronze statue of the god, which was then heated until the body inside was consumed. Whether every detail of this account is accurate or not, what is certain is that fire was central to Carthaginian punishment. To be burned alive was not just a method of execution, it was a message that Carthage had divine approval for its cruelty. Imagine being a soldier captured after rebelling against Carthage. You would not just face a quick execution by sword. Instead, you could be dragged into the city, paraded through the streets, and then handed over to priests who performed the ritual burning. Crowds would gather, children would watch, and enemies would learn exactly what waited for those who dared to rise against Carthage. Fear became part of the empire's political machinery, but Carthage also used humiliation as a weapon. Many prisoners of war were not executed immediately. Instead, they were enslaved. But this was not ordinary slavery. Carthaginian slave punishments were designed to strip away dignity. Rebels and captured soldiers could be forced into the lowest, most degrading labor. Some were used in salt mines, where survival was nearly impossible. Others were mutilated with ears or noses cut off to mark them permanently as enemies of the state. The goal was to erase their identity and turn them into living warnings. Now here is something you might find surprising. Carthage did not only punish its external enemies, it often punished its own leaders with the same ferocity. Generals who lost battles or failed campaigns were treated harshly. In Carthaginian law, failure was not tolerated. Some defeated commanders were crucified on the very walls they had failed to protect. Others were executed publicly, as if to show the citizens that weakness was unforgivable. Even Hannibal himself, the greatest general Carthage ever produced, lived under the constant fear of political punishment. Though he was never executed, his enemies within Carthage forced him into exile after his wars with Rome. This reveals something deeper about Carthage. Fear was not only a tool against outsiders, it was also a tool to control insiders. Soldiers, commanders, and citizens were reminded daily that loyalty and victory were the only things keeping them safe from the wrath of the city. Carthage also had a reputation for punishing spies and traitors with extraordinary cruelty. Instead of simply executing them, they often used slow methods. Some were reportedly nailed to crosses, while others were left to starve in cages. There are accounts of prisoners being torn apart by wild animals during public displays. These punishments were staged almost like theater. The audience was not just entertained, they were warned. The message was clear. Betrayal meant agony, and Carthage was always watching. At this point, you might be wondering, were these punishments exaggerated by Rome, Carthage's greatest rival? That is a very good question. Roman historians certainly had reasons to paint Carthage as a monstrous society. Rome wanted to justify its wars, so it often portrayed Carthage as cruel, greedy, and godless. But archaeology has confirmed parts of the Roman accounts. Evidence from Carthaginian sites shows mass graves of children and adults who were likely sacrificed, and inscriptions reveal the importance of ritual executions. So while Rome may have exaggerated details, the core truth is that Carthage truly believed in terrifying punishments. Another shocking aspect of Carthaginian punishment was its use of religion. The Carthaginians believed that sacrifices to the gods were necessary to secure victory and prosperity. During times of crisis, such as wars or famines, they increased the number of victims. Ancient sources even claim that when Carthage was losing battles, hundreds of children from noble families were sacrificed to the gods. While some historians debate the scale of this practice, there is no doubt that the connection between punishment, sacrifice, and religion was very strong in Carthage. To them, punishment was not only political, it was sacred. Think about how powerful this was as a system of control. If your city convinces you that the gods themselves demand the suffering of enemies, then punishment becomes more than justice. It becomes destiny. This belief allowed Carthage to enforce loyalty and obedience on a massive scale. No one wanted to defy a system where both the state and the gods were united against them. Public punishment also had an economic purpose. By enslaving enemies and forcing them into harsh labor, Carthage increased its wealth. The city depended heavily on agriculture, trade, and resources from conquered territories. Slaves provided free labor for farms, mines, and ships. Their suffering built Carthage's fortune. This made punishment a cycle. The more Carthage conquered, the more slaves it created, and the harsher the punishments became to keep them under control. Over time, however, the very brutality that had kept Carthage strong also created its downfall. Rome learned to use Carthage's reputation against it. Roman propaganda painted Carthage as a society of child killers and cruel masters. When Rome finally destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, the Roman Senate justified the total destruction by calling Carthage an evil city that deserved to be erased from history. And in a way, the punishments Carthage used against others came back upon itself. Its people were slaughtered, its survivors enslaved, and its city burned to the ground. Carthage, once the master of punishment, ended as a victim of Rome's punishment. Even today, the name Carthage carries a dark reputation. It reminds us of how power, fear, and cruelty can build an empire, but also how they can destroy it. The punishments of Carthage were not random acts of violence. They were carefully designed systems of control, supported by religion, economics, and politics, and for centuries they worked until Rome grew stronger and the same logic of fear was turned against Carthage itself. The story of Carthage teaches us something universal about history. Every empire that relies on terror eventually faces the same terror in return. Rome destroyed Carthage, but Rome too would later face its own decline, its own punishments, and its own enemies. The cycle of cruelty is endless in history, and Carthage is one of the clearest examples of it. So, when you hear about Carthage, do not just think of Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants. Remember also the darker side of the empire, the fires of sacrifice, the crosses on the city walls, the mines filled with broken slaves, and the unending fear that defined life in the Punic world. It was a society built on wealth and brilliance, but also on punishments so severe that even their enemies shuddered to describe them. And maybe that is the real lesson. Power without mercy can last for a time, but it cannot last forever.